The Jasons sat at their desk, the dim light of the desk lamp casting shadows across the cluttered room. Their fingers brushed over an old parchment containing one of the Beale ciphers. The storm outside raged violently, its thunder shaking the walls. The Jasons' heart raced as they leaned in closer to the cipher. "This could be the key," they muttered, their voice almost drowned out by the howling wind. The cipher held answers to a mystery that had plagued them for years. The storm's fury mirrored their inner turmoil, but they couldn't stop now. They had spent years tracking down this lead. There was something in the cipher, something important. As they deciphered more symbols, a feeling of unease crept up, but they pushed it away. The answers were within reach, and they weren't about to give up now. The Jasons sat back in their chair, eyes glued to the cipher. Their mind raced. The symbols on the page no longer seemed like random characters. They were a message. This could be it, they whispered to themselves, a mix of excitement and trepidation. The wind outside howled, but it was drowned out by the pounding of their heart. They had always known this was real, but now they could feel it deep within their bones. The treasure, the hidden truth, it was all real. They stared at the cipher one more time, now sure that they had cracked part of the code. But there was still more to figure out. The path was set, but it wasn't going to be easy. With a determined breath, they began to work through the next sequence of symbols, already feeling the weight of the mystery pressing down on them. The Jasons' mind raced as they packed their bag. The revelation in the cipher was just the beginning. The journey to Virginia was ahead, and there was no turning back now. The Elara Quinn had warned them about chasing after myths, but the Jason couldn't stop. "This is what I've been waiting for," they said, their voice quiet but resolute. They felt the weight of the map in their hand, knowing it was more than just paper. It was the start of something monumental. As they stepped out into the storm, the wind caught their coat, pushing them forward. This was the path they had chosen, and there was no going back now. The drive to Virginia felt long, with the rain blurring the road ahead. The Jasons sat silently in the car, their eyes fixed on the wet road as the Elara Quinn spoke. "You know this is dangerous, right?" she asked. "Chasing ghosts and cryptic puzzles. It's not worth the risk." The Jason didn't respond immediately. They weren't sure how to explain it. This wasn't just a mystery to solve, it was something more. The secrets that the cipher held could change everything. But they had to be careful. "I know," the Jason replied quietly, "but I have to know the truth." The Elara Quinn shook her head, but she didn't press further. She knew the Jason too well to change their mind now. They arrived at the location indicated by the cipher, a forgotten house surrounded by overgrown vines and neglect. The Jason's heart sank. "This isn't it," they muttered, disappointment creeping in. The Elara Quinn, however, was more practical. "We need to look deeper," she said, standing at the entrance, peering inside. The Jason hesitated but followed. "I know it's here," they insisted, determination taking over. They had come this far, and they weren't about to give up now. As they stepped inside the darkened house, the mystery seemed to grow larger, not smaller. They had found the first clue, but they would need to dig deeper. Jason sat across from the Sebastian Veil, in a dimly lit room. His pulse quickened as the older man, a figure of authority, spoke. "You think the cipher will lead you to treasure. But what if it's something much darker?" Jason paused. His gut twisted, but he remained silent, the weight of the man's words sinking in. The keeper's gaze was sharp, intense, his voice low. "Some things, Jason, are meant to stay hidden." But Jason had come too far to back down now. "I'll decide what's worth finding," he replied with quiet determination. The storm that raged outside seemed to reflect the tension between them, and Jason knew this would not be an easy path. After their encounter with the Sebastian Veil, Jason couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As he drove back to the hotel, his mind raced, trying to connect the dots. What did the keeper mean? Was it possible this cipher led to something far more dangerous? The Elara Quinn, sitting in the passenger seat, glanced at him. "You don't trust him, do you?" Jason didn't answer immediately. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the car, everything felt cold and silent. "I trust the cipher," Jason finally said, his grip tightening on the wheel. "And it's telling me we're not finished yet." Jason and the Elara Quinn arrived at the local library, where they had arranged to meet a researcher who might hold the key to the cipher's deeper secrets. As they entered, the heavy door creaked open, and the musty smell of old books filled the air. The researcher, an elderly woman with sharp eyes, gestured them over. "I've seen this cipher before," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not just about treasure, it's about a legacy, one that shouldn't be uncovered." Jason stepped closer, his heart pounding. "Why?" he asked. The woman's face grew pale, and she simply whispered, "Because it will destroy everything." As they left the library, the weight of the researcher's words hung heavy in the air. Jason's mind spun, wondering how far he should push this mystery. The Elara Quinn was quieter now, her worry evident. "Do you understand what she's saying, Jason? Some things are meant to stay buried." Jason shook his head, frustration building. "No, we're close. We can't stop now." His voice was firm, almost desperate. The more he learned, the more he felt compelled to continue, even if the truth was more dangerous than he could imagine. "It's not just about me anymore," Jason muttered, staring out into the pouring rain. "It's about everything we've been searching for." That night, Jason found himself in a forgotten mansion, the place the cipher had pointed to. It was silent, eerie, as though the walls themselves held memories too heavy to bear. Jason moved through the rooms carefully, the musty scent of decay filling the air. In the center of one of the rooms, a dusty chest stood. His breath caught. He had found it. But when he opened it, there was nothing inside. The Elara Quinn entered behind him, her voice shaky. "I told you it wasn't worth it." Jason stared at the empty chest. "No, we're missing something." They weren't done yet. Not by a long shot. Jason stood in front of the dilapidated mansion, its ancient structure towering ominously against the night sky. The air felt thick with secrets. He glanced at the map again, the markings growing clearer in his mind. "This place holds the answers," he muttered to himself. The Elara Quinn stood by the entrance, her arms crossed, looking doubtful. "You don't know what you're getting into," she warned. Jason's resolve didn't waver. "I have to know the truth. There's no turning back." Inside, the mansion felt even older, with its worn wood floors creaking under Jason's every step. He followed the map, each corner of the place seeming to whisper forgotten stories. The Elara Quinn's footsteps faltered. "This place is alive with history, Jason," she said, her voice tinged with unease. "Some histories aren't meant to be disturbed." Jason paused, but then pressed on. The history here might change everything. He moved toward the next room, unaware of the dangers lurking. As they ventured deeper, Jason found a hidden room, its door concealed behind a thick velvet curtain. The map had led him here. The moment the door creaked open, a rush of cold air swept through the room. The Elara Quinn hesitated, then stepped forward. "What if this is a trap?" she asked. Jason's gaze remained fixed on the dark space ahead. "I have to know," he replied, stepping into the unknown. The air smelled faintly of old parchment, and something more ominous. Inside the room, Jason found something unexpected, a large, ornate chest. He approached it slowly, unsure of what he might find. The Elara Quinn stood back, her worry evident. "Jason, please don't open it," she begged. Some things should remain locked away, but Jason couldn't stop himself. He knelt beside the chest and lifted the heavy lid. Inside there was nothing but a single, ancient key. The Elara Quinn gasped. "What does it mean?" Jason stared at the key, his thoughts racing. Jason stood holding the key, trying to make sense of it. "What does it open?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. The Elara Quinn stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room. "This place is a tomb, Jason. The key might be a symbol, but it could also be the last thing you need." Jason shook his head. "No, it's the beginning of something." His mind raced. The key had to unlock something more. But as he turned to leave, something moved in the shadows, unseen but felt. Jason held the ancient key tightly in his hand, staring at it as if it could answer all his questions. The Elara Quinn stood beside him, watching with a worried expression. "What if this is a mistake?" she asked softly. Jason didn't respond right away. He knew the risks, but he also knew this key was the final piece. "We're here for the truth," Jason said, his voice firm, though his hands trembled slightly. The mansion had secrets, and this key would unlock them. As they moved deeper into the mansion's labyrinthine halls, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, a feeling that intensified as they approached the next hidden door. The key fit perfectly into the lock, and as Jason turned it, the door creaked open with an unsettling groan. Inside, the room was dimly lit, filled with antique furniture draped in sheets. "This doesn't feel right," the Elara Quinn whispered, stepping into the room with caution. Jason's eyes scanned the space, his heart pounding. "It's all connected," he said, voice steady but low. As they stepped further into the room, an old chest caught Jason's attention. The chest was different from the others, more worn and covered in dust. Something about it felt important, something he couldn't ignore. Jason opened the chest slowly, almost reverently, his breath catching as the lid creaked back. Inside, there were more than just papers and artifacts. There was a leather-bound journal. The pages were old, brittle, but still legible. As Jason picked it up, he could feel the weight of its history. "This is it," he said under his breath. The Elara Quinn stepped forward, her unease growing. "What's in the journal?" she asked. Jason flipped it open, his eyes scanning the first few pages. The writings inside weren't just cryptic, they were warnings. "It's not just treasure we're after," Jason murmured. "It's something far darker." The room seemed to grow colder as Jason continued to read, each word pulling them further into the mystery. Jason read aloud the first line from the journal, his voice barely above a whisper. "The truth lies in the blood of the past." The words echoed in the silent room, and the Elara Quinn stepped back, her face pale. "This isn't just a treasure hunt," she said, shaking her head. "You're playing with forces you don't understand." Jason didn't look up from the journal. "I understand more than you think," he replied, his voice quiet but intense. As he continued reading, the room seemed to shift, as though the walls themselves were reacting to the ancient words. A cold wind blew through the room, though the windows were closed. Jason knew they had uncovered something dangerous, something that wouldn't let them leave easily. The wind picked up, howling through the mansion's corridors as Jason closed the journal, his mind reeling. "We need to go now," the Elara Quinn urged, panic creeping into her voice. But Jason stood, unmoving, staring at the journal in his hands. "Not yet," he said, a tone of finality in his voice. The air felt charged, as if the mansion itself was alive, breathing around them. The Elara Quinn grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the door. "You don't know what you've just unleashed," she warned. Jason finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of dread and determination. "We've come too far to turn back now," he said. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm they had just entered. Jason stood at the edge of the cliff, looking out over the dark, turbulent ocean below. The wind howled, and the waves crashed violently against the rocks. The Elara Quinn stood beside him, her face pale, her body tense. "We've reached the end, haven't we?" she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. Jason didn't answer immediately. He was too lost in thought. The journal had led them here, but what would they find when they went deeper into the unknown? "This is where it all comes together," Jason replied, his eyes never leaving the churning sea. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain: there was no turning back now. Jason's eyes shifted to the map in his hand. "It's here," he said, his voice unwavering. The Elara Quinn stepped closer, her breath visible in the cold air. "But what does it mean?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jason looked back at the map, tracing the markings with his finger. "It's not just about treasure. It's about something much more powerful, something that's been hidden for centuries. His voice grew darker, filled with realization. Whatever is buried here, it can change everything. The Elara Quinn looked at him, worry in her eyes. And what if it's too dangerous to uncover? Jason turned to her, his face set in determination. We don't have a choice. As they descended the cliffside toward the hidden entrance, the air grew colder, the wind more biting. The entrance was barely visible, camouflaged by the overgrowth of moss and vines. Jason pushed through the thick foliage, revealing the weathered stone door. The Elara Quinn stood back, her expression filled with doubt. "This is madness," she whispered. Jason didn't respond. He placed his hand on the cold stone, feeling a strange pulse beneath his fingers. "This is the moment," he said, his voice filled with awe and dread. The door creaked open slowly, revealing darkness beyond. They were about to uncover what had been hidden for centuries. Jason and the Elara Quinn stepped into the cavernous chamber, the air damp and cold. The walls were covered in ancient carvings, depicting scenes of battles and power long forgotten. Jason's eyes scanned the room, his heart racing. The key, the one from the journal, was still clutched tightly in his hand. "This is it," he said, his voice echoing in the silence. The Elara Quinn hesitated. "Do you know what you're doing?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. Jason turned to her, his face hard. "I have to finish this. We're too close." As he approached the center of the chamber, a pedestal stood, bathed in an eerie glow. The key would unlock something unimaginable. Jason placed the key into the pedestal's lock, and the moment it clicked into place, the room trembled. The ground shook, and the walls groaned as if the chamber itself was coming to life. "What have you done?" the Elara Quinn shouted, fear rising in her voice. Jason didn't answer. He was too absorbed in the swirling energy that surrounded them. The pedestal began to glow brighter, the symbols on the walls shifting as if they were coming alive. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the light from their lantern. "We have to leave now!" the Elara Quinn yelled, but Jason stood rooted to the spot, his eyes wide in disbelief. What they had unleashed was no longer under their control. The pedestal glowed with an intensity that seemed to pull at the very fabric of the room. Jason stood frozen, his hand still gripping the key, as a dark force began to swell within the chamber. The Elara Quinn stepped forward, her expression horrified. "Jason, we have to get out of here now," she screamed. But Jason couldn't move. A deep rumbling echoed through the room, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. "It's too late," Jason murmured, his voice barely audible. The power they had unleashed was beyond comprehension. As the air thickened with ancient energy, Jason realized they had awakened something far darker than they had imagined. The ground continued to tremble, and Jason could feel the vibrations in his bones. The Elara Quinn grabbed his arm, trying to pull him away. "We can't stop it now," she shouted. "The power is too great." Jason's mind raced, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the pedestal. It had promised answers, but it had delivered chaos. As the room seemed to shift around them, Jason knew they were in too deep. "We're not leaving until we finish this," he replied, his voice shaking but resolute. The pedestal began to hum, its glow growing brighter as though feeding off the chaos. A loud crack echoed through the room, and the walls seemed to bend inward. Jason and the Elara Quinn staggered back, but the force of the energy pushed them toward the center. It's opening!" Jason gasped. The pedestal's light had morphed into a swirling vortex, its power swallowing everything around it. The Elara Quinn screamed, but the sound was drowned by the growing hum. Jason could feel the room warping around him, as though they were no longer in the physical world. "This is what it was all leading to," he whispered, his words barely audible. They had crossed the threshold into something far beyond their understanding. Suddenly, everything stopped. The room was plunged into complete silence, the air now still and thick. Jason's breath was shallow, his heart racing. He looked around, but everything seemed frozen. The Elara Quinn grasped his arm, her voice trembling. "What happened?" she whispered. Jason slowly turned toward the pedestal. The vortex was gone, but the room felt heavier now, as though they were no longer in the same place. "I think we've opened a door," Jason said, his voice distant. He stepped forward, his hand reaching for the pedestal once more. "But to what?" Jason reached out, touching the cold stone of the pedestal. As his fingers made contact, the room shifted again. A low growl filled the air, and the walls began to crumble. "It's happening again," the Elara Quinn gasped, backing away. Jason didn't move. The pedestal pulsed with an unnatural force, and a shadow seemed to rise from the floor, stretching upward. "We've opened the way," Jason said quietly, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and dread. The shadow began to take form, growing larger and darker. Jason and the Elara Quinn were no longer alone. "We need to leave," the Elara Quinn pleaded. But Jason was rooted to the spot, staring into the growing darkness. The shadow before them grew larger, pulsating with energy. Jason stood at the edge of the pedestal, his body tense as the force in the room reached its peak. "It's awakening," he said, barely above a whisper. The Elara Quinn stood frozen, her eyes wide with fear. "We should never come here," she whispered urgently. But Jason remained still, his gaze fixed on the shadow as it began to form. It loomed before them, massive and filled with an ancient, dark power. "There's no turning back now," Jason said, his voice trembling but resolute. The energy was overwhelming, but it was clear. The secrets they had uncovered were far greater than they had imagined. Jason stepped forward, his eyes locked on the dark figure taking shape in front of him. "What is this thing?" the Elara Quinn asked, her voice shaking with uncertainty. Jason's hand tightened around the key. "I think it's the source," he said. The shadow before them seemed to respond, pulsing with energy. Jason could feel the power of the chamber seeping into him, both terrifying and magnetic. "This is what's been hidden," Jason whispered as the shadow reached out, a massive tendril of darkness stretching toward them. "We can't stop it now," Jason added. The Elara Quinn hesitated, then stepped forward, unwilling to leave him alone with the force they had awakened. Jason looked up at the shadow, feeling the weight of its power bearing down on them. "It's too late," Jason said, his voice strained. "We've opened something that shouldn't have been touched." The Elara Quinn stepped back, her eyes filled with tears. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Jason's mind raced. "We have to finish this," he said, his voice firm despite the fear growing inside him. The shadow before them shifted, its energy intensifying as if reacting to their words. The room around them seemed to close in, the walls constricting as the ancient energy grew stronger. There was no way out now. The only choice was to face whatever this entity had to offer. Jason took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "We have to finish this," he repeated, more to himself than to the Elara Quinn. He stepped toward the pedestal, the key still in his hand, and placed it into the base of the shadow. The room trembled again, louder this time, as the energy from the shadow surged through the pedestal and into Jason's body. "No," the Elara Quinn screamed, rushing forward, but she was too late. Jason's body began to glow with an unnatural light, his eyes glowing with the same energy. "It's too much for one person," she shouted. But Jason could only whisper, "It's the only way." The energy from the pedestal surged through Jason's body, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then the ground beneath them cracked open, and a deafening roar echoed through the chamber. Jason, now consumed by the light, seemed to be in a trance, his body thrumming with dark energy. The Elara Quinn fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Jason, please," she cried out, but Jason didn't respond. "You've done it now," she whispered, her voice breaking. The roar grew louder, and Jason's body began to glow brighter, as though he was becoming one with the shadow. The chamber itself seemed to distort as the power of the shadow overtook him, and everything went dark.